It doesn't mean that I'm an expert in it. It doesn't mean that I should necessarily put out videos on it unless I was collaborating with a true expert on it, right? So I'm not saying that you shouldn't have a podcast and have experts on. I just think you kind of have to know what your wheelhouse is and disclose when it is not something that you are a true expert in, not simply speak as if you are an expert on it. What's up, guys? So today we are going to talk about grifters in the industry. Now, I'm using the term grifter pretty liberally here, right? So obviously, if you think of the actual definition of it, it is somebody who is trying to swindle somebody who is trying to clearly take advantage of somebody, maybe sell them something they don't need or lie about it. And obviously that does happen in the fitness industry and many industries all the time. However, I am going to be kind of expanding the definition here and really just talking about people who you have to be a little bit wary of when it comes to their advice. Many times this is not with ill intent. There absolutely are the people who just straight up lie. So the biggest example of this probably in recent years is Liver King, right? This is somebody who very clearly knew that they were lying to millions of people and continued to lie. This is not like The Rock where everybody knows he's on steroids, but he tries to avoid the topic and hey, he's not selling anything related to fitness, right? This is somebody in the Liver King who makes up a whole persona about himself, clearly is lying about it, later does admit to lying about it, but then continues on and is probably still lying about things. Somebody like that.
I don't like the idea of losing over 20 pounds of muscle, so I've decided to go back on it.
That is a true definition of a grifter and somebody who hopefully, if you're, I would say, I don't want to say reasonably intelligent because some people are just ill-informed. They may be intelligent, but just not know enough to know that somebody like him was completely lying. But even if you are not somebody who is as informed, that is somebody who is probably pretty clear. However, there are many, many people who push agendas and maybe think that it is for the best. So for example, Liver King's partner, Paul Saladino, right, was pushing the carnivore diet, sells supplements, and was, I believe, a partner with a company that sells supplements related to carnivore diet, but then claims that he didn't know Liver King was on steroids. I think it's extremely hard to believe that somebody who knows him that well and knows the industry that well would look at somebody like Liver King and say, oh, I didn't know he was on steroids. I don't think many people actually believe that. So I would consider that the next step down. Somebody who's maybe not blatantly lying and trying to sell stuff in that sense, but knows about it with their partner and still has misleading videos and whatnot in order to promote their agenda. Now that is probably what I would see the most commonly in the industry. However, one step down from that would be people who seem to have good intentions, but they are pushing things that there's really not a lot of evidence for. Now, there's kind of two categories. There are things that we actually have evidence against, right? So for example, IgG allergy tests, where really what's going on most of the time there is that you will develop more IgG antibodies when eating a food more frequently. And so that can then show up on a test. And a lot of these food allergy tests are kind of BS, right? We have actual evidence against that. And if somebody is promoting that, they are either intentionally misleading somebody or they just really not up to date on the science. But there's other things where we just do not have the evidence for it. And people look at surrogate markers and they extrapolate that data. They will see an in vitro study and they will say, hey, this compound caused this in vitro in cells, and therefore we probably assume that it causes cancer because of this pathway. Therefore, nobody should consume this thing, not considering how the dose makes the poison and many other factors. And that is extremely common, not just in the fitness industry, but also in the health industry, also in many other industries where people will have an idea about something and then they will promote it. We see this with Gary Taubes. We saw this with him saying how carbs were horrible, even though more and more, I think actually even Peter Attia used to be partners with Gary Taubes, I believe, and it seems like there's maybe less of an association now because Peter has aligned himself with some more informed individuals who know that carbs are certainly not a demon and not causing obesity worldwide. Somebody like a Mark Hyman, his book was very difficult to get through because of how many things he extrapolates that we just don't have data to support. Not saying that everything he says is wrong, but that there is a lot that is not supported with what he is preaching. And that brings me to a very important point about people in this category, which is that they will say many things that are true, and therefore people who are not really in tune with that topic won't know when they start to deviate. So you could imagine if you had Neil deGrasse Tyson talking to you, and he was talking to you about the solar system and the planets, and he was talking to you about what chemical compounds are present on this moon, and then all of a sudden he tells you some completely made up fact. You would have no idea because it's completely out of your area. He could say that the Andromeda Galaxy is actually 5 light years away and it's actually 2 million light years away. If you don't know anything on that topic, you're just like, okay, I guess so. And hey, this guy's an expert and he knows way more than me. And therefore, I'm just going to listen to him, right? You have no idea. And so the reality is most of these book sales on fitness topics and these videos are not to people necessarily just watching fitness channels. They are to the general population. So you pick up a book and you have no idea anything about this topic, or you just have a general sense. Most people have a general sense of health and nutrition just from conversations they've had, but they say, hey, this person's a doctor, I'm going to read about it, and wow, like this sounds generally right, and this sounds generally right, and hey, this person talked about how this thing is cancerous, and this is a huge problem, and then look, they can actually cite this study that nobody's actually going to look into and say that obesity is caused by carbs. And people will see a study and they really believe it. I mean, you see this in many areas. They so strongly believe that this person knows what they're talking about because it's in a book, and therefore they're not going to go and look at the primary source of information, which, by the way, side tangent, that is how almost all of us learn information, right? If you go to medical school or dental school, you're not looking at every single study. You're just listening to what your teacher, your professor is telling you. I know many medical students who are extremely confident in the knowledge that they have, even if some of it might actually be outdated, but they went to med school and therefore their professor told them this and therefore they think it is necessarily true. Not always the case, right? Most of our information and the knowledge that we have comes from our own experiences or from somebody else teaching it to us. It is not necessarily looking at the primary sources like the actual studies and whatnot. But I don't want to get into too much of attention on that. The point being that when you listen to an authority, you're going to assume and continue to assume that, hey, if they are doing this thing correctly, or they are having success in life, or their results are what I want, and this seems to be in line with other things I've heard, well, then that next thing is probably also true. And so a lot of times, again, I don't really mean it in a grifter like they are doing harm intentionally, but a lot of these people do say a lot of correct things, and then their extrapolation gets a little bit too much, goes a little bit too far, and they end up saying things that are not supported. And that message continues to grow among the population, even if the actual original source of information was not solid. This goes into the topic of what would be called epistemic trespassing or promiscuous expertise, which is basically the idea that somebody who is an expert in one area then starts to share opinions on other areas that they are not an expert in. So an example of this would unfortunately be somebody like Andrew Huberman. Clearly an intelligent guy, clearly successful now, but references things that are not necessarily supported. So for example, there was one time he was talking about this study where the people had, I think it was like gloves to cool their hands, and the person had doubled the amount of reps.
Went from 140 maximum dips during a workout. A couple weeks later, using the cool mitt approach, 600 dips.
600 dips. 600 dips.
Now here's the interesting thing. Then does a workout with no core cooling and is able to generate the same output because he's adapted.
Anybody who has been lifting for a long time would hear that and think, okay, so if you can do 225 for 12 on bench, the idea that you're going to then put on some cold gloves and then do 225 for 24 reps is so ridiculous, right? Like if this was actually somebody who was training hard already and was actually pushing hard, that these cold gloves are going to make that much of a difference. It's just completely asinine, and nobody would actually believe that. But because he said it, there's probably many people who aren't serious lifters who would think, oh, this is gonna be some magic. This is gonna be the key to growth, right? Small example, but he does cross over into many other topics that he's not an expert in. And this is just necessarily one of the things that happens when you have a podcast is you're going to end up discussing many things that you're not an expert in. I don't think it's a problem at all to have opinions on things. I have many opinions on things that I'm not a true expert in, and I have a podcast. So there's many things I'm going to talk about with people, and I'm just going to be casually conversing with them, and we're going to talk about different things, and I'm going to share my opinion, right? So I might have a lot of opinions on finance. It's something that I have an interest in. It's something that I've read many hours on, and I could talk about it with many people and I'd be interested in, or real estate. But it doesn't mean that I'm an expert in it. It doesn't mean that I should necessarily put out videos on it unless I was collaborating with a true expert on it, right? So I'm not saying that you shouldn't have a podcast and have experts on. I just think you kind of have to know what your wheelhouse is and disclose when it is not something that you are a true expert in. Not simply speak as if you are an expert on it. Jordan Peterson might be another example here where he is an expert in a couple of key areas, right? I believe he taught at Harvard, University of Toronto. Obviously now he's become very famous and there are certain things that he knows a lot about. But when he starts talking about nutrition or climate change or something like that, it's clearly not his wheelhouse. And so it's something that, and I think he actually does a decent job of disclosing, hey, I have my opinions on nutrition. This is my personal experience. I'm not an expert on that. And I can really appreciate that because it is something that he acknowledges he's not an expert in. But many people do not. Many people start to read about a certain topic and now they're a coach. Now they have videos on it. Again, not a problem to have opinion, but you have to establish when it's something that you can really confidently speak on versus just giving an opinion. So as a final note on this topic, I would say that to some degree, there is trust involved here. You have to trust somebody if you're going to be learning anything from them. However, hopefully you can have a keen eye out for when somebody is kind of BSing versus when they have a clear background in that area. That does not necessarily mean that they are extremely educated, but that they at least have real world experience over a long period of time. So if I look at the two areas I feel like I know the most about in my life, right? I'm a doctor of dental surgery. That is something where a formal education has gotten me to be very adept. And then I have the world of fitness where I do have a formal education. I have a bachelor's in health and exercise science, but that aside, it is also something that I've been extremely passionate about since I was 12 years old, right? So I have 20 years of in-depth learning, of course, the podcast, of course, interacting with other people. Those two areas I would feel very confident in, whereas there are other areas where it's just more of a passion project or just something I have a tangential interest in, and you have to be able to differentiate that. And so I would say if you are wondering who can I follow in a space, I would try to find people you trust who follow somebody in that area. I would try to look at their pedigree, how long they've been doing something, what their actual background is. And to some degree, you're gonna mess up, you're gonna make mistakes, you're gonna follow people who don't necessarily have good information, and then you just have to be able to course correct. So that is it for the video today, guys. If you enjoy the video, like, subscribe, comment down below, and I will see you next time.